The climate threat is not new. We've known for a few decades that this was going to be the big issue in the 21st century. This is clearly the biggest threat to the planet. We have an emergency.
We have this whole new injection of people in the last 10 years, young, hungry, ambitious, eager engineers who want to do great things.
It started out as an academic pursuit, but once we started working on this, it seemed like we might actually be onto something.
You have a set of these small startups run by, these really young, idealistic people who have kind of come up with these really innovative designs. Call it Nuclear 2.0.
We wanted to develop a new type of nuclear reactor that can consume existing stockpiles of nuclear waste.
We need to be building reactors all over the world as soon as we can. If we care about climate, if we care about dealing with emissions, we need to build nuclear so they don't build coal or burn other fossil fuels.
I want to build an advanced reactor in the next decade so that we can build them all across the planet.
To put this simply, a nuclear reactor is not an app. This is not the kind of idea that can be fueled on pizza and lines of code. The risk is proportional to the reward, and this is about as big as it gets.
I'm Ross Koningstein. I worked on Google's effort to make renewable energy cheaper than coal. We published a bunch of material from this. I realized that slowing or reversing climate change could not be addressed without new energy technologies coming to bear, particularly cost-effective ones. And in 2014, I founded the Nuclear Energy R&D group here at Google. And we wanted to see how we might accelerate R&D and advanced technology, something that could bring about more scalable, zero-carbon, always available, cheaper energy for humanity. For those of you who are not students of nuclear science, nuclear processes are fundamental to matter and energy in our universe. We're made of matter that was formed through slow fusion in stars, and our heavier elements were formed through supernova experiments, not so much, supernova and nuclear decay. And nature is naturally radioactive. So the nearest radioactive source is right near me, in fact, comes from the potassium-40 that is decaying in my panelists and myself. So on that note, I'm looking forward to some scintillating discussions with this group of innovators and experts. So first off, let's introduce David. David Schumacher, award-winning, actually Emmy Award-winning director and producer of The New Fire. Welcome. You're a graduate of the Berklee School of Music.
That's right.
And then took a left-hand turn to go into the world of film under esteemed filmmakers such as Barbara Koppel and Ken Burns. And I think most of us are aware of one or two works that Ken Burns has worked on. That's great. You became really inspired and driven to work on The New Fire, as we have talked about several times. This is great. And you tie it to the environmental need, the technological abilities, and the opportunities that are out there. That's great. Our next panelist, Carolyn Cochrane. She is the co-founder and CEO at Oklo, Inc., a company named after a naturally occurring nuclear reactor in Gabon, if I remember correctly. So Carolyn earned her BA in economics, her BS in mechanical engineering from the University of Oklahoma, and her MS in nuclear engineering from MIT. She has a background working on solar vehicles, natural gas, oil refining, and of course nuclear engineering. And her company, Oklo, is working on clean energy plants for microgrids where advanced fission reactors can pair and work along with renewables. So it's pretty exciting. Tyler Ellis is the founder and principal of Black Ellis Partners, pardon me. He received a PhD, SM and SB degrees from MIT in nuclear science and engineering, and also an MBA from Harvard. It's probably our most decorated panelist. So previously, Tyler was on the founding team at TerraPower, which is a Bill Gates-backed nuclear energy company, and now at Black Hills Partners. He is an entrepreneur, investor, scientific advisor who works with both the private and public sector to bring high-impact energy technologies to market. And Meng Yao. Meng Yao Yuan is a postdoctoral research scientist at the Carnegie Institution for Science at Stanford. She recently got her PhD at Stanford for studying carbon capture and other low-carbon technologies. And her current research focuses on modeling and analysis of near-zero emission energy systems. So thank you all so much for being with us here today. And so let's talk about advanced nuclear energy technology and the solutions and opportunities that it may present for the future. So perhaps let's start with maybe you could provide a little motivation for each of you to let the audience know what you're about.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, David.
Yeah, well, I'm not, I went to music school in Boston and then on 150 Mass Ave, and then I found myself on the other side of the Charles River on Mass Ave at MIT. Why would I go and do this? I was just worried about climate, like everybody else, and when I sort of realized that the science about how do you decarbonize was not really being followed by the policymakers and the just general public opinion. People had no concept of how do we actually decarbonize and what role nuclear would have to play. I felt like, well, this is really worrisome because we have to solve this problem. At the rate we're going, it's not going to happen. And so I felt like that's kind of a bold statement and kind of a very contrarian statement, perhaps. And it's probably not the most popular type of thing to do. But I felt like once I sort of met some people that were working in this field, and I found, saw these amazing sort of heroic folks who were really just dedicated to providing clean energy for the world, even if it's misunderstood at this time. I thought that people have to see this because I was so amazed by what I learned that to be able to present that journey of discovery that I went through to other people and they could see get the whole thing in 85 minutes as opposed to, spending 3 years doing all of this. That's what I felt was really exciting about it.
Great, thank you. Carolyn?
Yeah. I think in some ways my journey parallels David's. Not entirely. I was engineering in undergraduate, but I didn't know anything about nuclear at all, and met some nuclear engineers. Actually, Tyler in an undergraduate engineering internship in DC. I was mostly interested in policy. I thought I was going to go to grad school in robotics with mechanical engineering, and really just became convinced after I was very skeptical about nuclear, but learned more and more about it. And my kind of underlying passion is environment and health, and just realized that this is one silver bullet that you really don't see something quite this impactful. So I became passionate about it, decided to go work for a year, reapply to grad school, and that's how I ended up at MIT. My co-founder, Jacob DeWitt, who's here actually today, was passionate about commercializing something in advanced nuclear, and so I became part of that group. But what we really realized was people needed this kind of power. What we're looking at now, they needed it yesterday, basically. These microgrids are just starving for clean, reliable power. So that's how we really got focused in on this really, really small concept.
Great, thank you. Tyler?
Yeah, mine actually starts back to freshman year where you have to pick your major. And then I said, okay, I got into a good school. I think I should work on something that's high impact to society. And I said, okay, we have genetically modified crops for food, we have desalination technologies for water, and we have cheap building materials for shelter, but energy is really the underpinning factor that we don't know how we're going to get all that it is we need to get. And I said, okay, I'll work on that. And then I looked at all the energy sources that you could scale up without emitting massive amounts of CO2 in the interim. And I said, okay, nuclear technology is the best option there. I said, I'm going to go work on that. And I spent about 7.5 years at MIT and then subsequently worked with several other startups afterwards.
Great. And Meng Yao?
Yeah, so what got me started in the energy and the environment space is Captain Planet and the Planeteers, which I really enjoyed watching as a kid. But what keeps me going is just the sense of accomplishment that I get from doing something I find meaningful.
I have a question for David. So, of course, congratulations with the release of the film, which was like this weekend, right?
Yeah, Friday.
Yeah, pretty awesome. Yeah. And I think you've told us a bit about your motivation behind the story. Can you tell us about the reactions at the film festivals and what you think the path for the film will be?
Well, I think that the path with the film is just going to be #1 box office smash worldwide. No, I mean the point of the film. This isn't a commercial film. I mean, when you go about making a film like a documentary, you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? And there's generally 3 buckets it could fall in. It could be to make that money. You know, I want to make as much money as I possibly can. Or it could be, I want to be famous. I want as many people to see this film and awards and reviews and everything, and it's a really big deal. Or I want to change the world. And I'd love to do the first 2, don't get me wrong. But my main priority with this film was changing the world. And I think that the thing that it was able to do, and the biggest concern that I had, was that people who are concerned about the environment and concerned about climate and sincere about that just don't understand nuclear and don't understand the role that nuclear can play to really solve this problem, this energy problem, this climate problem, this social justice around energy problem, sustainable development problem. Nuclear is something really interesting that can really help with all of those issues. And I felt that if I could somehow bring a story that can appeal to those sensibilities of those type of people and get them to accept, especially advanced nuclear in the role of innovation. We're already doing a lot of renewables. We're already doing storage. We're already working on efficiency, systems thinking, all of that stuff. What else can we do? Because this is a big problem. This is the biggest problem we've ever had as a species. What about technology? What's next in the pipeline? And if you think about it in that respect, the development pipeline, the low-hanging fruit in energy is nuclear. So I think it's really interesting, and I hope that environmentalists will see that this is, that we're environmentalists too. And that's, I mean, Caroline could even talk about, she was at the screening at the world's largest environmental film festival in the nation's capital. And we're accepted as environmentalists. I mean, it's amazing. We've been to 4 environmental film festivals, and it's really amazing.
So one of the things that many people might not know is that some of these film screenings have Q&As. What were the reactions like from the people who saw the film?
I would say that we've had some really great reactions. I had one couple that came up to me after our screening at the Philadelphia Film Festival, Environmental Film Festival, and they said, you know, we lived downwind from 3 Mile Island. These were older folks than me. They were young adults living around 3 Mile Island when that happened, and they were very scared, and it became very anti-nuclear in the wake of that, and started a branch of the Sierra Club, and they were very anti, and they said, you know, they came up to me and they said, you know, we have a friend who's been pro-nuclear, and she's been trying to convince us, and it hasn't worked. But, you know, seeing this film and seeing these next generation reactors and the people behind it made us, you know, really interested and inspired. And I think now we actually have changed our minds. And that was a really big deal. I mean, I think it's a big deal for people to change their minds. But I think also at these environmental film festivals, there's a lot of disaster porn. You know, there's so much bad news in the environmental space that to bring a positive solutions-based story was kind of a really nice palate cleanse. Beyond that, it was just in contrast to everything else. So I couldn't have asked for a better quality of response than what we've gotten from the environmental film festivals in particular, but film festivals in general, I would say.
That's great. Well, let's switch gears a little into technology and a systems view. So I think, as we all know, you know, in the early 1900s, a telephone was this 40-pound box that was attached to the wall of your house, and you had to hand crank it. And here we are today, and we carry, you know, something that you can call anybody in the world from, and it fits in your pocket, and it happens to have a computer and all sorts of other good stuff in it. Nuclear technology, sadly, has not seen the same rate of advance. However, there are a number of advances that have occurred. And Ming-Yao, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you think of from traditional nuclear energy, which is basically 1950s technology, and how that fits into the energy system, and compare that perhaps with the possibilities of advanced technology nuclear.
So traditionally, nuclear power is a large-scale, zero-emission technology and has played an important role in the U.S. energy system. Nuclear currently represents 20% of the electricity generation in the U.S. and more than half of the country's carbon-free electricity. The energy system is changing rapidly, however, and nuclear faces competition from cheap natural gas, especially in the US, as well as increasing penetration of wind and solar PV. And because of the variable generation from wind and solar, we need technologies that can fill the gap between variable demand and variable generation. And currently, natural gas is filling this role. But to minimize the impact on the climate, we would need substitutes that are carbon-free. And these technologies would also need to be cost competitive with natural gas, because eventually everything would need to compete on a $1 per kilowatt hour basis. Future energy technologies will also need to be reliable and flexible to accommodate the variability in the grid. And they would also need to be climate resilient to adapt to the more challenging operating conditions caused by climate change. And advanced nuclear technologies could be an important player in a future energy system if they can tick these boxes. And I look forward to learning from the other panelists about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's hop to that panelist. So, Carolyn, you are in an advanced nuclear energy startup. Could you tell us what that's like?
Yeah. Well, you know, in the movie it says it's not like an app. That's true in some ways, but in some ways it actually is, believe it or not. And that's part of why we're based here in Silicon Valley, is because we feel like the focus that's on developing and turning out something quickly is really important. We also have friends who are doing other kind of really cutting edge things like quantum computing and things like that. But I almost think this is harder than that in a way, because we're not just trying to break new ground, but we're trying to break new ground in such an old industry. And kind of like what was mentioned by the other panelists, is we've got an industry where it's no joke, they still use analog devices frequently, okay? So we're talking dials and levers and stuff. And so we're trying to do this in a totally new kind of reactor, using tested technologies from the labs from decades ago, but basically totally new in a commercial sense for the microgrids, but trying to do it within an industry that is incredibly backwards and not necessarily always friendly to that kind of new innovation. So it is. I think we're in a really interesting spot in that way. We're trying to use computers. You know, now with computing power, you can actually model an entire reactor. Used to be, you really couldn't do that. And so, you know, using Python and using modern scripting and computing capabilities to really turn this around much quicker and much cheaper. So, yeah, it's a really unique space.
Okay, so you have the perspective of the nuclear innovator. Tyler, I'd like to turn to you and get the perspective of somebody who helps make things happen and funding advice, et cetera. So in the advanced nuclear space, there's about 30 startups operating today in advanced nuclear. What do you see as some of the things that need to happen there to really make that successful?
Yeah, so I mean, each individual company and technology approach kind of has their own specific things that would be most beneficial. So, you know, for one company, maybe their central technical risk is a new materials development program. For another company, maybe it's a complex simulation and finding kind of the optimum topology of reactor layout. So, kind of each individual concept and company kind of has their own set of technical milestones that would be most helpful. In the investment space, I think there's a variety of interesting things that are happening there with the rise of a lot of new funds that have longer timelines and providing access to physical facilities in order to perform a lot of earlier stage prototype development and proof of concept without having to spend all of the money to build up one of those types of facilities. And then just generally connecting those types of organizations with large strategic companies that can help them scale up or help them learn how to kind of better really ramp that up into a commercially viable type of design. And then on the regulatory front, I think there's a number of kind of interesting developments there as well, as far as the NRC is entirely rate-based. So about 90% of their fees are recovered from the rate payers, but they're starting to change some of those requirements such that smaller companies can go and talk to them and have interactions. For establishing kind of a large-scale design, it's between like $40 to $100 million, which is pretty expensive for a lot of early-stage startups. But you're starting to see movement in that space in order to try and alleviate that burden, so kind of newer, more exciting technologies have a shot at actually getting to market without having to raise hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to get over that hump. Because that high amount of capital is a pretty significant barrier to entry for a lot of the earlier stage startups. So you have to be really keenly focused on what is that central technical risk. Let's do what we can to take the maximum amount of risk out early, and then use that to justify the subsequent round of financing.
Yes, that definitely is one of the challenges in the nuclear space, because energy is about 10% of the world economy, so the potential revenue stream is huge. Yeah. But scaling a company and technologies to deliver that, you need money to make that happen. Great. Well, I'd like to turn now to the panel part of our discussion, and I'd like to talk for a little bit about the circular economy. So the circular economy is somewhere where you reduce your environmental footprint by designing out waste, remanufacturing your products, regenerating your systems so that your waste stream becomes incredibly small, and hopefully your supply stream also becomes quite small. Of course, to do this, you tend to need to add energy and processing to make these things work. So, for example, Google has realized quite a few savings as well as reductions in waste in our own implementation of circular economy in the management of our data center hardware. So nobody likes to throw out lots of used electronic equipment. So if you can close that cycle and minimize your waste stream, then you have a much smaller environmental impact. Energy technology can play a real role in this, and so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the circular principles of reduce, reuse, and recycle, et cetera, and how we could embed that at a larger scale into society's infrastructure. How do you see the next generation of nuclear reactors fitting into that picture?
Yeah.
Tyler.
So, I mean, just to kind of reiterate what you said, the amount of waste itself is actually incredibly small. When you look at, it's a football field 9 foot high, which is the waste stream for the entire United States, 20% of our electricity generation for about 60 years. If an individual got 100% of their electricity from nuclear energy, lived to be 100, their waste would fit inside of a Coke can. It's very well contained, very small, so it's a fairly small amount to deal with. A lot of the existing nuclear reactors burn about 0.7% of kind of all uranium that exists. There's two isotopes, U-235, U-238. Many of the advanced reactor designs can go upwards of close to 50% utilization, which is a significant expansion as far as the uranium utilization. And then also, once you actually split the uranium in there are a variety. You get basically the entire periodic table in your spent fuel element. So there are a variety of uses for many of those isotopes for medical applications. Molybdenum 99 decays into technetium 99, which we use for 20 million imaging procedures in the medical field today. So I think there's a lot of opportunities with many of those advanced technologies to increase the uranium utilization and or reuse their fuel for making new fuel assemblies.
Mm-hmm. Meng-Yao, I think you had a comment? No. So,
I'd like to add to that.
Oh, sure, please.
If there's extra time. Once I learned about nuclear, I found it's almost like the ultimate circular economy situation, because you can try to recycle a lot of things, but very few things can you recycle and produce clean electricity at the same time. And so that's really what's so amazing about it, and part of why we're passionate about our technology too. It's one of the ones that Tyler was mentioning, where you can really make use of the entire, a large portion of the remainder of the nuclear fuel that's been used. That's why sometimes people call it used nuclear fuel instead of waste, because one analogy is like if you bought a liter of pop and took a sip and threw it away, we can use a good portion of the remainder of that. So that's really important to us, is closing what we call closing the nuclear fuel cycle. But also, like, you think about so many different products we use today, maybe we can try to recycle them, but they use an incredible amount of energy to recycle. So the carbon footprint of recycling is sometimes greater than just making it new, although you're still talking about resource impacts on the globe, right, and in the environment. And so we have to focus on what has the lowest carbon life cycle footprint, and that's really nuclear by a long shot. When you account for whether or not you have to have backup power or storage for an energy source, and then if you take that, which is already incredibly low carbon footprint, and then recycle it, then you really have an incredible situation for the environment. So that's why we're really excited about it.
And you've mentioned the electric part, but there's also the primary energy part, where the large-scale use of natural gas or other fuels that go into manufacturing.
I just wanted to throw something out here, is that we're talking about the waste. So when people hear about nuclear waste, does anybody worry about that, or anybody concerned about nuclear waste? Okay. Well, that's reasonable, because when you pull spent fuel out of a reactor, that's pretty nasty stuff right then and there, and you definitely don't want to be anywhere near it, or you won't live very long. But the thing I think is really interesting is the reason that I'm making this film at all is because of fossil fuel waste. That here in the United States, we're putting 100 million tons of it into the atmosphere this week and every week. That's how much we do just in the United States. We only use about 10% of the world's energy, I think it is. And yet we're worried about a football field of spent fuel. Now, how many people know the difference between high-level waste and other waste? So when you hear about the 5 million gallons of high-level waste, does anybody know what that is? So the scary stuff, the high-level waste, is from military when they were doing the Manhattan Project. And they were just in such a rush to let's get the bomb as fast as we can. They weren't really worried that much about the waste and so forth. So there's millions of gallons of waste that has not been fully remediated yet. And, so that's kind of the cost of getting the bomb finished in time and finishing the Second World War. However, on the nuclear energy side, every bit of nuclear spent fuel, nuclear waste that is produced by the nuclear energy industry is collected by the nuclear energy industry, it's controlled by the nuclear industry. There's never been a fatality from that, from any civilians certainly. And it's a big lie out there about nuclear waste as something dangerous. I mean, imagine if the fossil industry collected and controlled its waste. Imagine if that happened. We wouldn't even have this climate problem, would we? But yet here we are worrying about nuclear waste. No one's ever died from it. So who benefits from that? That's the question I want to know. Your fear of nuclear waste, of radiation, who benefits from that? Because you're not supporting nuclear. So then if people don't support it, it's not going to get built. Then what fills the void? Think about that.
On that thought-provoking note, let's shift the discussion to what's next. So just sort of anybody, please comment. What do you think is needed to scale the advanced nuclear reactor industry?
Well,
please.
Happy to go. I think there's a variety of things. For a lot of the new startups, kind of as I mentioned before, having some sort of a new mechanisms in the regulatory side is going to be very beneficial, because as I mentioned, it's very capital intensive to have any sort of a regulatory review. So that would have a very massive impact. I think another thing that you could do would be, right now each individual state has a renewable portfolio standard, and they actually define winners as only wind or solar, so they kind of are artificially selecting winners. I think the original intent of the legislation is really to encourage non-CO2 emitting generation. So if on an individual state-by-state basis we were to go around and say, okay, let's change the definition from only wind and solar to all non-emitting generation sources, I think that would go a long way towards helping that out. And then I had one other, but I'm forgetting right now.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, the public-private partnership side. I think there's a variety of interesting mechanisms that could be used to, a lot of Department of Energy experts and other experts in the government can have public-private interactions with the private industry. So whether that's leveraging a lot of their large testing facilities at national labs so startups don't have to rebuild all of that, or tap into some of that expertise, I think that could go a long way. And then one of the other things that was really beneficial in the NASA COTS program, which basically provided about $400 million to SpaceX and allowed SpaceX to be the success that it is today. From other companies that didn't win that award like SpaceX, they were actually able to interact with NASA experts and then have NASA sign off on the technology approach and then have independent experts say, yeah, that's reasonable. If you build that, that will work. Then they were able to take that to the private investors and say, oh, well, you have NASA experts signed off on that. We're going to fund you to get to your next milestone. And that actually encouraged a lot more innovation to happen, which was phenomenal, beyond just the individual winner of the public-private partnership.
I think that what's interesting about what Tyler's talking about, though, is that's different between nuclear and space travel and what SpaceX is all about, is that who doesn't want to see that type of, they're talking about going to Mars, like that's exciting. Who isn't excited about that? But in the nuclear business, we're going to build a new reactor. Like, hey, people just don't get as excited. You don't capture the imagination of the public. But it really should, because this is how you get off fossil fuels. And after all, it's all about keeping it in the ground. That's what we have to do, is keep fossil fuels in the ground. So if you're ever wondering about a problem with nuclear, like the safety, no one's ever died from a nuclear plant, including 3 Mile Island in the United States, ever. Yet, what happened in San Bruno a few years ago with natural gas? So we didn't have a moratorium on natural gas after a bunch of people died when there was a big natural gas explosion in their neighborhood. But yet, you know, at Fukushima happens, which nobody died from radiation at Fukushima either. And Germany shuts down, everybody shuts down. And it's just amazing because who benefits from this and who fills the void? Fossil. Fossil is still the fastest growing form of energy in the world right now. Out of all of the new energy, the capacity that's put out in the world, renewables is only about a third, less than that. The vast majority of new energy is filled with fossil, and so you're not even replacing existing. The only thing that has ever, you know, worked at the scale and speed necessary in the world is nuclear. But some people aren't going to be happy about that. Because if you think about the energy industry, it's 10% of the world technology, and the fossil industry is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. It's crazy. It's huge amounts of money. Nuclear is a few $1 billion a year in the fuel space, because it's basically free fuel. It doesn't cost any money. Like 1 gram of uranium has about the same amount of energy as 2 tons of coal. And in those 2 tons of coal, there's 4 parts per million of uranium. So when they're burning 2 tons of coal, they're actually spewing more uranium out there into the earth for all of us to breathe and whatever, than you would need to burn in a reactor to create the same amount of energy in the first place, and then you'd have waste from 1 gram of uranium, which is like a size of a pea. So this is how insane it all is. And why? Because public opinion, people are afraid of radiation, people are afraid of nuclear safety, people are afraid of all that. But if you look at the facts, what's the most dangerous form of energy? It ain't nuclear, it's coal. Nuclear is at the bottom. It's the safest form of energy along with renewables. Yeah. And, you know, hydro is actually much more dangerous because people have, you know, there's been bad accidents, but it's not dangerous. And radiation, it turns out that we're way over afraid of radiation. There's no like the amount of radiation required in a year to evacuate from a place, according to, you know, Health Physics Society and EPA and other guidelines, is 100 millisieverts annual dose. Well, there's no biological evidence of anybody ever getting cancer, having a bad health outcome from receiving less than 100 millisieverts, not over a year, but over the course of a few seconds to a few minutes. Nobody's ever died from a CAT scan. Nobody's ever died from an MRI. Nobody's ever died from a PET scan. Nobody's ever died from a chest x-ray. That's never happened. There's no evidence of it. Yet here we are being told of these risks that are not real risks. It's all like everything is upside down in nuclear. Everything I thought I knew was wrong, and it's just it's bonkers, but it's so liberating, and I just hope some of you folks, you know, look into this. It's really interesting.
So it's really interesting to see that if you're particularly data-driven, and you can set aside your feelings on the matter, then you can arrive at this kind of conclusion, right? But, you know, most people who actually don't have a lot of information, they rely on things they see and hear. What do you think about the importance of having demonstrations of new technology in the nuclear space that the public could somehow see and use as a basis for reevaluating perhaps what they think?
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue, because I was just going to echo what Dave is saying and Tyler is saying, but also, you know, how do we scale this up, or how do we really change things? I think we have to build it. I don't think we necessarily need huge government programs to do that. I think huge government programs usually lead to the kinds of outcomes that you don't want to see in this industry, which is more backwards thinking and more kind of anti-innovation thinking, which is what we're battling basically every day, right? And then what's really behind all of this, there's not a big motive there because there isn't the education, the stuff that Dave's talking about. People aren't passionate. Like, you see people who've learned some things and then they get really passionate. It's really amazing. But by and large, like you're saying, people aren't. And so there isn't the motivation for the politicians to push things or to give credits, or I think it all comes down to what people really want. And I think when you build something, especially our reactor is kind of what we call community size. So it's small enough that there's literally nothing that can happen to it. And you can have a small piece of land where people could come and actually come pretty close to the reactor because it is that safe, and we can demonstrate that. And then they can see it and they can feel it and touch it, and I think it's not as foreboding as huge plants that have large amounts of water intake. Like, we don't require any water, and you can't come anywhere close, and there's huge guards and guns and fences and all those other things. So yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. It's just building it and letting people see it firsthand, and letting them make their own decisions, and giving them education to know what's real and what's not real. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, the interaction is a huge part. I mean, you get greater social license when you actually bring people in and show them, as opposed to, oh, well, this is super secret. You can't see what we're doing. We're going to put a black box around everything, and then you just have to trust us. So having that interaction, I think, is very key for kind of the next generation to be successful in deploying new technologies.
And what we're seeing too is communities are already opting in instead of saying, okay, we have this huge plant, we have to site in this one, kind of low-cost area, and so poor people end up having to move or whatever. It has a socioeconomic effect, but when you have this small thing that communities can decide to opt in on because it's small enough and cost-effective enough for them to do that, we are seeing communities that are saying, hey, I want that for mine, and that might be Native American communities or small communities up in Alaska, and so we're basically already having what's almost like a early purchase list, because there's communities that are like, hey, I want that in my community. I want my community to be entirely carbon free. And so we can pair that with renewables and have, electricity at night, or when the wind doesn't blow, or when it's really dark and extremely cold in Alaska. And so I think there's incredible power if you can have an opt-in situation.
Great.
Another advantage I would think of to build more reactors is to drive down the cost of nuclear, because currently the high capital costs, especially of nuclear, is a barrier that prevents, I think, further development of nuclear. So by building more reactors, we could learn from the experience and potentially lower the cost of this technology.
Great. So we have a number of people here in the audience today, and a number of people who are likely watching us through the internet. Do you have any words of wisdom or advice to people who are interested in learning more about this, wanting to make a positive impact on the world, or simply get involved somehow in the nuclear conversation? Please.
Well, first place to start is check out the movie's website, newfiremovie.com.
Commercial plug.
I can't resist, I have to do it. But the thing that we've done on the film is we've, on this website that we've just relaunched or expanded out, is it explains sort of a bit about the technology, and it has links to all sorts of different sources of information. So if you want a jumping off point to get into learning about this, if you go to the website, that's a pretty easy place to start.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, we participate in this film because I feel like there's not like a single great source to point people to. People are like, hey, I want to learn about advanced fission. Like, what is it? How is it different from solar plants? What is nuclear at all? I don't have like a lot of resources. I'm like, oh, this is a really great way, and it's user friendly, and it's not really technologically dense to learn about this. And that's part of why we participate in this film, is hopefully like it gets the word out about what's going on and a little bit about the tech, and then the website has more resources. So yeah,
Tyler.
Additional plug.
So I completely agree with all of that. I think the big thing that I would say would be to start today. Don't start tomorrow or next week. We've had enough delays, so people, if you want to get involved now. I think reaching out to a variety of startup companies in the nuclear space are a great way to get involved. You can either help them out in some way, shape, or form, and that can kind of put you on the cutting edge of a lot of that technology. I think that's a really exciting way to learn about the technology as it's being developed and kind of re-engineered. There are a few other industry websites where you can do a little bit of additional background reading. So Nuclear Energy Institute is a pretty good source of information. The World Nuclear Association is another good source of information. If you want to do background reading, that can kind of give you a rough lay of the land and understanding of the technology.
Just keep calm and carry on. Gosh.
Okay, great. Well, I think we are coming up on our Q&A period. Camilla, do we have some questions?
Can everyone hear me? Oh, there we go. So one of the questions we had come in was, it seems apparent that we can no longer reduce carbon, we have to remove it from the atmosphere. Should we use the need for energy to sequester carbon to justify nuclear energy?
Yes.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Well, that's one of the cool things, I think, about having such an energy dense and non-carbon emitting source of electricity is you can do really wild things. So we've looked into pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and basically making a carbon neutral form of fuel for vehicles or planes. You can do that when you have such an energy dense form of electricity. You can do desalination in really effective ways. But yeah, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is one of the things that nuclear can be really well suited to.
Mm-hmm. I would just say that I think it's probably better to use the nuclear energy to sort of produce energy and offset fossil and get rid of fossil, and then once we're at zero fossil or as close to that as we can get, then start using it to suck the energy or the CO2 out. But that's a small point.
Yeah, a big part of the challenge though is there has to be some mechanism that values removing CO2 from the atmosphere, because right now there's no economic way with which that is valued. So I think one of the big things for that is actually just being able to have some sort of a market mechanism that addresses and values that sort of technology approach. And then as soon as something like that happens, then you're going to see a lot more movement. But nuclear is, I think, probably the best way of being able to actually power a facility like that.
Before, you had mentioned using last-gen waste as next-gen fuel. Does that limit at all where these next-gen reactors can be built? Do they have to be built next to waste sites from former waste, or can they be dispatched in other locations?
Yeah, it's pretty small. I mean, as Dave mentioned, the fuel part is only 5% of the cost of nuclear electricity. So even if you were to spend a little bit more money or have it be a slightly more complex process, it really doesn't impact the net price of electricity much at all. And then, the kind of the choice between using fresh uranium fuel versus using used fuel is more of an economic type of question, because remanufacturing old fuel or reusing old fuel will cost a bit more money. But then it's more of a societal level question of where do we make our investment in, and how much do we value utilizing that used nuclear stockpile of fuel, and then manufacturing new fuel elements from that, versus paying for a repository or something like that. So it really kind of comes down to what that particular society is optimizing for. If we're trying to have the smallest repository possible, or if we're okay using dry cask storage on reactor sites, or just what the desired mix is. That'll be different for each country.
Then I think a great question is, can you define advanced nuclear?
I'll start, I guess. There are a lot of different definitions, so it makes it kind of tough. Congress defined it as any, they have politically motivated definitions that are like any reactor after a certain year. I think usually when people say advanced, they mean non-light water reactors. So in other words, all of the existing commercial reactors in the United States today use huge amounts of water, and they use water for cooling in moderation. So ours doesn't. A lot of these advanced technologies don't. There are some other people who would define advanced as more or less having what we call passive safety characteristics. So in other words, inherent safety. So even if an operator wasn't there, the reactor literally couldn't melt down. So there are some light water reactors that have some of those safety characteristics, what we call passive safety characteristics. So sometimes they get lumped into the advanced reactor bundle. So it kind of just depends on what you want to call it. I think usually people use it as a way to define newer technologies. So in the last couple of decades, they use passive safety to ensure that there's no meltdown capability.
So I think that the important thing to think about when you're thinking about what is an advanced reactor is and why would you want an advanced reactor is precisely building on what Caroline said. Right now, we have to use water as a coolant, and you have to get up to about 300 degrees Celsius or something like that, and water boils naturally at 100 degrees Celsius. So I think that means you have to be at 150 atmospheres pressure or so. You got to keep that water at that level, and imagine the amount of, the size of what you're dealing with, and the magnitude and the strength of everything, and it has to be fail-safe, and it has to run 100% of the time for 40 years. That's a big ask on materials and on this big plant, where if you say, well, why don't we just use material like a coolant that can't evaporate, you know, and we could get it up to like 1,000 degrees Celsius. It's still not going to, there's no way it's ever going to evaporate, and it could just run at atmospheric pressure. Well, as soon as you do that, it just gets way smaller and way less complicated and way fewer parts and way simpler. So why didn't we ever do that before? Because we didn't have the materials at the time. When they, you know, in the 1950s, when they needed to get a reactor going, it was like, what can we get going that's going to work right now? And that we can put in a submarine that's going to work right now. And it was a light water reactor, and that made perfect sense. But in the past 60 years, with all of the developments and materials and everything else that's happened, the fact that we're still using water as the coolant to nuclear reactors is just, I mean, it's great, but it's like going to Cuba and going, oh, look at all these great old cars, it's so nice, you know, 57 Edsel, that's so great. And it's like, but don't you think the people of Cuba want to be driving Teslas like everybody else? I mean, it's charming, but we need new technology, and we need the social license, and we need people demanding it. If you want to get off fossil fuel, if you want to get at the fossil industry and make them real mad and hit them where it hurts, advocate for nuclear. This kind of nuclear.
And so to that point, the current state of the nuclear industry, what is happening with these old reactors from the 1950s? Are they being shut down with any replacements? Are they being upgraded? How is that changing?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that dynamic-wise that are changing. So I mentioned one, the renewable portfolio standards in individual states, which is actually mandating a certain percentage of electricity which has to be purchased from either wind or solar. And then the way that a lot of those markets work is that they quote out the total number of megawatts they need for the day, and each individual state will say, okay, well, this certain percentage has to be from wind and solar, and then that moves all the other resources out of the stack. And because of the advent of cheap natural gas, it's actually pushing what used to be one of the cheapest sources of electricity generation, which is nuclear fission power plants, out of the stack and making it challenging for them to be able to actually sell all their electricity. So that's why you're actually seeing a lot of challenges with regards to should we keep this plant open or not. I mean, these are very long-lived assets. You know, they're originally licensed for 40 years, but we're doing license extensions for 60 and likely 80 years. And they're replacing a lion's share of the components in there. So, you know, these already constructed facilities can operate for a very long period of time. But, you know, really it's it's kind of a market type of a dynamic. And, you know, the advent of the renewable portfolio standards have really changed that dynamic of being able to sell that electricity. So I think that's the challenge. It's not a waste issue. It was partially kind of related to a cost issue, but it's because the market was actually changed. The rules of the games were changed. And that's what actually is really hurting a lot of existing generation now.
I would say one interesting thing, though, that's happened in the last couple of decades is massive upgrades to these plants. So we've added maybe, 8 gigawatts of clean electricity to the grid just because these plants use advanced technologies to grow larger and produce more clean electricity. It's really valuable, obviously, for the grid, because if that's 9 gigawatts we don't have to produce using something else, that's really a good story for the environment. Even if we don't think that those are necessarily the kinds of plants we should be building now, I've been really happy to see some of that. So these plants are operating at 95+% capacity factor, so almost 24/7. And if you can squeeze out, double-digit percentages greater power out of the same plant, and that's what they've been doing just because the need for power has been great.
And they had, I mean, as you mentioned before, the better computational tools. So the way these reactors were designed in kind of the 1950s and 40s, they had very large margins in there. And then after they've kind of sharpened the pencil with a lot of their advanced computational tools, they realized, oh wow, we can actually get a lot more electricity out of this, and we can shave those margins down to a more reasonable level rather than excessively large margins. So that's also part of the...
So some states have had decent emissions cuts just because of upgrades of nuclear, which is obviously a good thing.
Great. And then you mentioned before the high barrier to entry, sometimes with the cost of capital needed to start a nuclear reactor. And so we have a question that says, nuclear power is distinguished from most other technologies in that its cost increases with time. So do you agree with that? And if so, why does that happen?
I totally disagree with that. It's arbitrary. The price of energy is arbitrary. I mean, if you think about energy, what is it all predicated on, right? It's all predicated on this asset, this commodity, fossil fuel commodity that started out as coal, and it was a small thing to do, whatever they did with steam engines at first. And then gradually you got oil and then gasoline, kerosene, gasoline, and natural gas, and became this multi-trillion-dollar industry, the fossil industry. So we predicate our whole grid, all of the energy that we get is predicated upon feeding money to this commodity industry. It's not infrastructure. Like, it should be infrastructure. It should be like building a hospital, building roads, building, sewage for cities and stuff. It should be thought of as that. Nuclear power, just like renewables, is power for the people. It's about ideas, being smarter, not using resources to get energy. There's using some resources, but it's about using just really smart science to be able to get a ton of energy out of the tiniest little, it's mind-boggling. And it's a huge threat to the fossil industry. But the fossil industry's had a good ride. I think it's time for them to sort of pass on the torch, and it's time for the world to start thinking of energy more as a public good than as a business, commodity-driven type of thing that's all for the benefit of enriching a bunch of folks that don't necessarily have the best interests of the planet in mind.
But I think we can point to economic statistics. So the question referred to what we call a negative learning curve in economics. And there are examples of positive learning curves in nuclear, and I believe Korea is an example of that, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe we could just turn that question around to the panelists and say, what do you think would have to change for nuclear to go on a positive learning curve again?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that the cost escalation of a lot of the plants in the United States is not representative of the global experience around the world. A lot of the costs in the United States have gone up due to lengthening of the regulatory and permitting process and a wide variety of other challenges. It's very easy to challenge a lot of these projects and then subsequently through the court delays drive up a lion's share of these costs. Also, American labor is a lot more expensive than labor in other countries. So if you compare the plant construction costs in South Korea, which has some of the least expensive power plants, the other thing that they've done is they've standardized designs. So in the United States, we have about roughly 100-ish types of reactors. They're all a little bit different, as opposed to South Korea kind of made a choice of we're going to have one plant design, we're going to standardize this, and then we're going to come down that learning curve. So that whole coming down the learning curve necessitates some sort of a standardization. So then you build it over and over again, and then those people that were helping to construct this reactor can apply those learnings to the subsequent reactor, and so on and so forth. And that's where you're really getting a lot of the savings. So I think the cheapest cheapest reactor construction projects in the world are going to be driven by the South Koreans, driven by the Chinese, where they're really standardizing a lot of these designs and building a lot of the same types of plants, because that's really where you're going to get the savings.
Tyler has summarized it very elegantly, but I just wanted to add that if you're interested about this topic, I would recommend reading Jessica Laverin's pieces on this. She also appeared in the movie, I believe, so she has some excellent work on this topic.
Okay, well, on that note, we are out of time. And we greatly appreciate each of you panelists taking time out of your day to be here today and sharing your knowledge with our audience and also out in internet land. So everybody, please join me in thanking the panelists. And also a big thank you to Camilla Montes de Oca for making this panel discussion happen. Thank you, Camilla.